Change lives.
cambiar vidas.
Change lives.
Change organizations. 改变世界。
Change organizations.
Change the world.
So think about the last time you sat in front of your computer on a Sunday afternoon, blank screen, and you're supposed to look for that dream job, the one you've almost convinced yourself doesn't exist. Or you made a resolution to run a marathon, but 26 consecutive miles sounds really daunting. So you don't even walk out the door and go for a jog. Or think about the last time you got your heart broken and you weren't sure, you couldn't imagine how you were going to recover and find love again. I'm not trying to depress you, but I'm trying to get you to think about these personal challenges that can seem so overwhelming that it's almost impossible to start. And I think it's true in our personal lives, and I think it's true in how we engage with the world. So now try to think about fixing inner city education in America when it seems so broken. Or this downward spiral of partisan politics in the US that seems sort of predestined. I could go on, but I won't. But in my own life and in the lives of so many people around me, I see how we stand in the face of seemingly insurmountable challenges, where the outcome seems out of our control. And it's almost like the bigger the problem, the bigger the excuse not to solve it. So what really scares me is this idea of this predestination thinking, these foregone conclusions, where we convince ourselves that we can't have an impact. And so over the next 15 minutes, I'm going to talk to you about one way that we can avoid these foregone conclusions, and we can find a path forward. So, imagine you're standing at the foot of Everest, foot of the Himalayas, and you've decided you can't summit Everest. So you're not even going to try to get up the first peak. That's the way I think about it. And the best way I know how to explain this challenge is through a problem that's very dear to my heart. So, it is 8 a.m. on a Monday morning in 2009, and I take off onto the streets of Hyderabad, India, where I lived for about 3 years. And I'm on my scooter. I love my scooter. And I'm dipping and weaving through traffic, and I pull up to a traffic light, and I am surrounded by motorcycles and auto rickshaws and diesel trucks and passenger cars, and maybe a camel if I'm lucky on a good day. And as I sit there, the conservationist in me is disgusted. I think about my lungs. I think about global warming. I'm asking myself, why can't people stop buying so many damn cars? The human in me, the economist in me, is thinking, how cool. People are moving forward. They have enough income to buy a car, and they have somewhere to go. This is progress. And there it is. The tension, what I believe is one of the biggest tensions of our global generation. People are coming out of poverty at a time when suddenly we care about the environment, when we're aware of resource scarcity. And the rules have changed. But I fundamentally believe that people shouldn't be punished for bad timing. So the 1.5 billion people in the world that lack modern electricity deserve the same energy infrastructure that we have here. 1.4 economic development. On the other end of the spectrum, 1.3 billion Chinese people, 1.1 billion Indians consuming like Americans is an unsustainable outcome. So this talk is not about convincing you that climate science is accurate. So I'm going to ask you to make two assumptions with me. One, climate change exists. Two, we should do something about it. So if you can come along with me on that, then here we stand. Economic development and climate change are slamming against each other, and it seems like a zero-sum game. One step forward for economic prosperity, one step backward for climate change. And it seems intractable and just so stuck. UN negotiations on climate change have stagnated. China's polluting more than the US. We see charts like this. As the world prospers, the climate goes downhill. And when faced with this kind of challenge, it's pretty easy to feel like there's nothing we can do. It's like watching this slow-motion train wreck. And since we can't do everything right now to fix it, we do nothing. So I'm going to take you back to that traffic jam. So I'm sitting there, and I'm generally feeling pretty upbeat. The vibrancy of life around me, I find it all pretty amusing. But there's this question in the back of my mind. What's the point? At the time, I was making clean energy investments that were trying to reach the 400 million Indians that don't have access to energy. I was trying to chip away at this big problem, investment by investment, customer by customer, and it felt really slow. What's the point? What if I'm 90 years old and gray, and I'm looking back on my life, and nothing's changed? That traffic jam is probably going to be worse. There are probably still going to be hundreds of millions of people without modern electricity. Why don't I do something where success is more clear? Those questions terrify me. That fatalism. And so that got me thinking about how we motivate ourselves in the face of monumental challenges, where the outcomes seem fixed and we feel small. So I'm trying to convince you today, and maybe I'm also trying to convince myself, that small does not equal powerless. And that just because you can't do everything to fix a problem doesn't mean you can't do something. So you're standing at the foot of Everest, at the foot of the Himalayas, and you've decided you can't summit Everest. But you can climb that next peak. And it might be worth climbing in its own right, for its own sake. And it might give you a new vantage point on Everest and a new path forward. So, if my Everest is walking this narrow ridge with economic prosperity on one side and climate change on the other, I'm going to tell you about one peak that I'm currently climbing. Do you know what this is? Yeah. It's a diesel generator. It is expensive, dirty, polluting, and it is the only way that most people in the developing world have access to electricity. It's my arch nemesis. It's the bane of my existence. So, you see these on the streets. You see them across rural areas for pumping water, 5 million across India just for pumping water. But it's not just poor farmers. It's how business runs. Manufacturing, telecom, mining, all running off of diesel gensets. It's the only way to keep the lights on. And for me, the diesel generator is this acute symptom of this macro challenge. It's what drives the economy, but it's also more polluting than your typical coal-fired power plant across the world. So here's the catch. We pay 10 to 12 cents a kilowatt hour for our electricity here in the US. That diesel genset, I talked to Suraj, a textile manufacturer in Nairobi recently. He pays 35 cents a kilowatt hour for power, 3 times what you pay. It doesn't make sense. So the diesel genset is one peak, and people are starting to climb up it. We're starting to see progress, and it's through extending the grid, it's through alternative energy, a number of different people climbing. So you have government. In the last 10 years, 200 million people have gotten connected to the grid in South Asia, reducing the demand for diesel. You've got big business involved. So that everyone loves to talk about the mobile phone revolution across Africa and South Asia. They're mostly run on diesel gensets, those telecom towers. They're starting to offset their diesel with solar. Not for PR, but because it's economically rational to do so for the first time. You have entrepreneurs going places where government and big business won't go. This is Husk Power Systems. They manage biomass power plants in rural Bihar, one of the poorest states in India. They're serving about 200,000 people with biomass power at 1/3 of the price of diesel. And right now I'm working with a group on a waste-to-energy solution that will serve manufacturers in Kenya, like Suraj, and replace their diesel power. So will eradicating the diesel genset revolutionize this climate change, economic development paradox we have? Probably not. But it is one peak that we can climb, and we should climb, because it makes sense, because there's a better way, and because it's fulfilling in its own right, at least for me. And maybe it'll help us chip away at this huge, intractable, seemingly apocalyptic problem, and make it feel a little bit less apocalyptic. So what does this mean for you? Maybe development and climate change